Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. While we have a few more people trickle in, I'll just note that we've got the option to ask questions throughout the webinar, and we'll get to answering those towards the end, hopefully with plenty of time. So welcome to this webinar on the implications of grid connection queue reform for the UK solar and BESS markets. I would say that if not the biggest shift of 2025, then maybe it was the most controversial one when NESO published the results of its grid connection queue reform pretty late in the year. The need for a reform to the process by which grid connections were managed has been long-standing, and when the current government announced its target of achieving a clean energy system 95% powered by renewables in Clean Power 2030, that need for reform became all the more pressing. So in April, about just under 6 months after Clean Power 2030 was published, Ofgem confirmed the methodology by which NESO would reform the grid connection queue, eradicating zombie projects from the queue. The narrative very quickly became that the reform would create winners and losers, which I think became quite a convenient way of beating back any kind of criticism of that methodology and then of the results when those were announced. I mean, I think it's worth noting that the reform was a huge undertaking, and the UK is sort of leading the way in having tackled its queue. It was the largest queue to connect to the grid, but it's not the only place where people are waiting a very long time to get a grid connection. But I think the ramifications are fairly far-reaching of the reform. So to discuss that with me today, I'm joined by Joe Colebrook from Innova, Tom Williams from Blake Clough, and Josh Corns from Solar Media Market Research. And I think a good place to start would be if you each introduced yourself, perhaps explaining sort of your experience of the reform and maybe what you see as kind of like the headline impact of the reform, starting with you, Joe.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. So Joe Colebrook, so I'm head of grid connections at Innova, one of the largest developers in the UK with a pipeline of over 7 gigawatts that is into the Gate 2 process. Where I see, one of the biggest impacts, I think it was, of grid reforms, or at least perhaps one of the more unexpected impacts, was the lack of advancements. So I was expecting many more projects to be going either swapping from phase 1 to phase 2 or moving into phase 1. And I think that's the 7 gigawatts of under in solar is quite an interesting fact. And yeah, in terms of how I've been involved in grid reform, so I was largely involved in the working groups that sort of formed the methodologies and formed the process with which we've gone through. So sorry if it didn't work, but I did largely agree with it. Yeah, and it's been a very interesting journey over the last couple of years.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Tom Williams. I'm a senior consultant at Blake Clough, and we're a grid connections and power systems consultancy with a presence in the UK as well as a team in the Middle East. And we've worked with a lot of the GB developers throughout the past year, specifically related to the reforms, as well as supporting them on other aspects of project development, from feasibility, grid connection due diligence, and compliance studies. So I personally have been heavily involved in our response to the reforms and followed it along since they were first announced in November, and have been in multiple conversations with network operators, DNOs throughout this time, and have been following it along like everyone else. And I would say probably the main outcome of the reform, besides the obvious uncertainty that it's added to the industry for development at this time, is also probably that developers still have a sense of not much clarity on where they're being steered towards, where new generation and storage is needed in the country, and what are the prospects for greenfield compared to the existing pipeline absorbing the capacity that's needed right now.
Yeah, hi, I'm Josh from Solar Media Market Research. Just a bit of background. I or my team track all solar BESS wind projects in the UK throughout their life cycle. So all the way from very early stage tech register projects all the way through to operational. Throughout the grid reform, we've been translating projects from the tech register and from the DNO's embedded capacity registers into actual projects in planning portals, planning inspectorate, ECU, etc., providing who the developer is, as well as substation, DNO region, CP30 transmission regions, all of that stuff, for developers specifically to kind of identify, formulate queues, and make assumptions from that. In terms of impact from the grid reform, I think the lack of advancement is obviously a very big question on people's minds, pretty glaring to be honest, but I think it was much needed in terms of the grid reform itself. As we know, the queue for BESS was extortionately large, and for solar, there was a lot of sometimes even pre-land projects where people obtained grid for cheap. It's been going on for 8-9 years now. And so we needed to clear a lot of that out the way so that we could start building projects. But one big question still to stand is, although some of the queue has been cleared, there's obviously the procurement side of things, and with projects with 2027 grid connection dates still not having a firm date, there's a lot of questions to be asked and a lot of timeline constraints, which again we can all talk about later.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I think that sets quite a nice tone for our discussion today. As you can see here, we've got sort of an overview of the results from NESO from Blake Clough. Tom, I wonder if you could just talk us through what we're seeing here.
Yeah, absolutely. So this table is essentially a processing or a synthesis of the data that NESO published in December. And I suppose I'll take you through column by column just to give full details on what we're looking at. So you've got the strategic alignment targets in the light blue column on the far left for battery, solar, and onshore wind. Then built capacity, followed by the protected projects that went through this gate 2 to whole queue. Now that is clause 1 or 2A protections, not considering future protections in the future application windows. Then there's the gate 2 projects that were issued, so the total gigawatt capacity of those offers for each technology type. Then there are gate 1 projects that met the readiness criteria. So this means that the vast majority of those, they evidenced that through holding land, and yet there was not strategic capacity available, and so those sites were given gate 1 offers. Those metrics have been summed. So if you sum the built gate 2 and gate 1 ready capacity, that gives you the entire ready queue capacity. So that gives you a reference for how much of a pipeline is there currently in GB for each technology type. A couple of things of note: if you compare the 243 gigawatts of either consented or land rights holding batteries against the 28.7 target, you have that 8 or 9 times oversubscription in the country. And that's before you even consider the full queue, which is in the column to the right, of roughly 380 gigawatts of capacity that was available in the tech register and ECR. Now there's more uncertainty in that because you don't have full visibility of the technology components and accurate data all the time from DNOs or the TO, but it gives you that sense of scale of who the competitors are for batteries at the moment. Likewise, if you look at solar, you have approximately 105 gigawatts of a ready queue. So that's built, gate 2 or gate 1 ready. which is approximately 1.5 times the current targets, giving you a sense of the GB-wide competition at transmission and distribution level. And there's a much smaller overshoot for onshore wind. The other kind of key piece of information you can extract from the data they published was the amount of readiness attrition. So that proportion of the capacity of projects that had grid connection offers, according to the Tech Register and ECR, compared to how many of those were able to evidence land rights and meet that minimum readiness criteria. So that's varying significantly across the different technologies, with solar having the highest rate of sites that have fallen away, failing the readiness criteria. So looking at the green column, you see that's at 48%, whereas onshore wind only at 16% compared to what was in the grid connection registers. Then lastly, the kind of final 3 columns gives you a feel for where do we stand today? What's the extent of the oversupply compared to the targets? Now for batteries, I've already touched on it, but you have the first column of those 3 oversupply columns, you can see that there is an oversupply of 62 gigawatts of gate 2 batteries compared to that 28.7 gigawatt target. That came from enough sites holding protections, so meeting that clause 1 or clause 2A criteria, holding consents or holding a capacity market contract or similar, and therefore being guaranteed strategic alignment despite the target desiring less BESS than that, according to NESO's modeling. And then sitting beyond that, you have batteries with future protections. I believe that Josh and Solar Media have a slide that indicates approximately 40 gigawatts of batteries are in planning at this time, and will most of them qualify for future protections that guarantees them a gate 2 offer or gives them advantages in obtaining one. And then you have the remaining 120 gigawatts of ready projects that are also more progressed in the future. Now, the reason why the existing pipeline is so important for developers is because of the way that projects will be selected in the future for aligning to strategic capacities. So the more progressed a project is, the more it is prioritized ahead of others of the same technology type that apply in the same application window. And the ordering is all sites that are consented are in a first tranche ordered by the date they obtain consents, followed by any site that is land rights only or in planning, ordered by the date they obtained land rights or met that readiness criteria. So what this means is these sites that have already met the land rights and likely have started to progress with their planning consent application, that's your main source of competition as a developer looking at greenfield or holding a gate 1 offer and trying to see the likelihood of that being converted to gate 2 in the future. And then lastly, just keeping it to battery and solar, I'll just touch on the oversupply within solar. So you can see that first of these 3 columns, there is a 0 oversupply for solar at the moment. And that's because the target has been met with how many gate 2 offers have been issued. But within that, the phase 1 targets, the 2030 pathway, has approximately a 7 gigawatt undersupply because of, as Joe touched on, the TO rejecting advancement requests for a large proportion of the projects that went through the gate 2 to whole queue process. And then finally, you have that smaller excess of ready projects coming through for solar there.
Great, thank you, Tom. And just to clarify that the difference between protected and gate 2 is that ahead of the reform to the connections queue, projects that had progressed to a point where their position in the queue changing would be essentially holding them back, were given protected status and stayed where they were in the queue as the reshuffle continued sort of behind them, is how I would summarize that. So Joe, as you touched on with the TOs and that like undersupply, was that an easily predicted outcome, do you think?
No, so I suppose it depends how you interpret the methodologies. So, when we were going through the working groups and putting these together, certainly my interpretation, so there was a step in the queue formation process. I don't know how many people are familiar with the bingo card, as it was known, but the 7-step process that NISO are following to do the queue formation. There's a step which was step 5, where transmission owners were allowed to veto advancement requests because they didn't think that the network could be reinforced in time to allow them to connect in the phase that they wanted to connect. So either phase 1 pre-2031 or phase 2, which was post 2030. Now, my interpretation was that step was only meant to be used where there was a clear justification that the local substation work. So, maybe a new new substation needs to be built, grid supply point needed to be built, that when that happened, if that wasn't going to happen by 2030, then they could veto that move to phase 1. I didn't think that it should be applied to sort of wider reinforcements and sort of looking at the rest of the queue. So in my head, the way the queue would be done is you sort of put the protected projects to 27, 26 and 27 projects at the start of the queue. You leave them alone. All the other projects essentially get a big, just completely reformed the queue. So all the most ready projects go at the front. And unfortunately, I don't think that's quite happened. So I think that's largely because of this. For some reason, the TOs have felt that it's not appropriate to advance people, and either they've interpreted differently to me, or they just don't think that the network can be built in time for 2030, which maybe is a bigger question and a bigger discussion to have with them.
Yeah. So sorry, Josh, you go on.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's a really big point, is the lack of infrastructure in a lot of the regions. I know UK Power Networks is always an example I like to use, that although it's got the substation in terms of DNO with the largest queue at Bramford, it has also almost no infrastructure down in the Kent East Sussex region. And so the queue there is actually, I think it's about 2.6 gigawatts undersubscribed. The pipeline is also still not quite there in terms of reaching that readiness criteria, but there's a lot of projects there that haven't been given gate 2 offers purely down to the lack of infrastructure in that region. And I think that's a really important thing to look at when talking about a lack of advancement, because although there may be the projects in that region, they may have land, they may have the readiness criteria, they simply can't be built because of the TOs. So I think that's a really important reason as to why there's a lot of questions around advancement.
Yeah, I suppose, Josh, the one thing I'd say there is, could they have been advanced if another project would have been put further back in the queue? Because that was part of the process, right? It's that it was meant to essentially swap, the projects that are most ready, put them at the front, and the least ready at the back. So if there was a project that was more ready and it didn't get to connect because there's a lack of infrastructure, because that infrastructure is being taken up, or the existing infrastructure is being taken up by projects which are less ready, that for me is a failure of the process and what we were hoping to achieve, the principle of grid reform. But if there's not infrastructure for anyone, then that's possibly.
Yeah, I mean, I was having a look at the grid supply points in that region, and around the East Sussex region towards Kent, I think there's only about 2, maybe 3 grid supply points in the whole land, and there's a lot of space down there, which is why there's such a lack of projects. But then you move over towards East London, Essex region, which is around where Bramford is. There's a huge amount of solar farms, and I mean, Bramford has about 650 megawatts that are approved, and so it's quite hard to reshuffle that queue, because they're all at that same kind of stage. So I do agree in terms of, you could argue there should have been a reshuffling and a bit of advancement, bit of pushing back. But if they're all at the same kind of stage, because there's a huge amount of projects in that region, then it does make it tough.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that just needs more explanation by the transmission owners.
Yeah, hopefully we get a few more answers on why there was a lack of advancement in some regions.
I'd agree that was, for me, the biggest surprise of how the reforms ended up being implemented, was that widespread use of the TO rejecting advancement, which meant that progressed projects with a current firm connection date of 2031 or later were prevented from leapfrogging the less progressed projects that have existing connection dates in 2030 or earlier, which resulted in a smaller amount of queue reordering and a smaller amount of reprioritization as we were expecting from the reforms. And so just adding to that, we're in alignment there, basically.
Definitely. And we've touched a bit there on methodology and perhaps some confusion around it. And I think we can kind of come back to where perhaps responsibility for that confusion might lie. I suppose one thing is that this process of managing the queue is going to be ongoing now. This was the first time it happened, but we can sort of moving forward probably have a better idea of how things will look based on the outcomes this time. So I suppose what we can also look for is a pattern in how the various windows for new grid connection offers will affect planning. And we can do that by looking at sort of the impact that it all had last year in 2025 and the end of 2024. We've got some figures from Solar Media Market Research that, Josh, I think you can talk us through.
Yeah, sure. So essentially this graphic just kind of shows the pipeline growing as we've gone along. So there was the big spike back in 2014-15 where almost all projects in that time then got built out just because of all the incentives. But as you can see, as we move along each year, other than 2024, submissions have been growing. But 2024 is really noticeable about Q4 and how big it was. Because of the December 20th deadline set out by NESO for that protection status, there was a massive influx. I can't remember the exact figure, about 2.4 gigawatts maybe submitted in December alone, which was up to that point the biggest month ever, and Q4 was the biggest quarter ever. Approvals have also been going up year on year, but obviously with submissions, approvals going up. And then Q2 and 3 of 2025 were absolutely massive once again. June and July especially were huge just because of the deadline originally set for the end of July for submissions for that protected status. Once again, there was over 40 applications went in July, and then there was a few in August. I was expecting more to go, all of them to go in with July, but as we know, the portal caused a few issues. They pushed back the deadline by another month, and then there's about 10 more applications went in August. Q4, however, then saw a massive drop-off. Basically, all developers had submitted all their applications and then sat on their hand pretty much, just waited around, didn't really do too much, waiting for their gate offers and still waiting for their firm dates. And only 4 or 5 applications were submitted in the entirety of Q4 2025. So as you can see, there's over 26 gigawatt peak of approved projects now that are still waiting to start construction. Some of these projects are phase 1 with protected status up to the end of 2027. And I think that's a big thing I touched on earlier with the procurement issues, the lack of firm dates that have been assigned. We'll talk about that later, but with a lot of projects having this protected status, there's a lot of waiting around, and there's going to be a lot of competition once these get given out. We'll move on to the next slide. So this is a little bit of analysis on Clean Power 2030. So Tom did the analysis for the whole of the reform up to the end of phase 2. This is specifically for up to the end of phase 1. So each of these are the targets per DNO shown by the red dot. And then the pipeline is broken down by operational at the bottom all the way through to the early stage scoping projects. So projects that are submitted either an EIA or pre-application notice, which is in the grey. This doesn't include, and it's worth noting, it doesn't include projects that may have received Gate 2 offers but haven't started any form of consultation or haven't started any form of scoping. And that's just purely because it's really hard to clarify whether a project is a zombie project, if it's moving, and a lot of these projects will have received phase 2 offers anyway. So the 7 gigawatts of headroom is pretty glaring, to be honest. The pipeline was there in terms of there was over 37 gigawatts in the pipeline. And so because of that lack of advancement, it does leave the question, if we had the pipeline, why didn't we use it? UKPN was the most undersubscribed, which is about 2.6 gigawatts they gave, even though, as I mentioned earlier, Brantford had the longest queue. This graphic shows that it was only actually about 300 megawatts undersubscribed in terms of pipeline, 2.3 gigawatts of a change there. Northern Power Grid, as we know, it was quite oversubscribed. Norton and Craigbeck had a lot of congestion in that region. And as I said, 36.8 gigawatts, which pretty much meets the exact criteria or the exact target set out by NESO for up to the end of phase 1. We'll talk about transmission and then we can have a bit of a discussion about it. So this graphic might look a bit confusing because NESO have only really published regions. They've left quite ambiguous numbers in terms of what they've assigned per transmission region. So I've gone for the average. For example, in T3, it was between, or T10, sorry, it was between 0 and 500. So I've just gone for 250 megawatts assigned. And then for T4 and 5, it's greater than 4 gigawatts, but I've just used 5 gigawatts as just a random guess, or an educated guess, because T5 could be 6 gigawatts and T4 could be 4.1. So I've just used 5 as the number there. So T5 and T4 had very long queues. T4 had a lot of scoped projects and not many projects at planning. So it was a bit surprising that there was such a high amount of Gate 2 offers assigned, whereas T5, obviously there's a lot of pipeline, a lot of projects in planning. As we can see, there's a lot of approved projects there as well as submitted. And then T6, I was a little bit surprised at the fact that it didn't get that greater than 4 gigawatts of assignment, because although the target there was set, the pipeline there is the biggest of any transmission region. Scotland's transmission pipeline is very small, hence a lot of early stage projects did receive Gate 2 offers. There'll be some developers sat in here who did receive a Gate 2 offer, even though they haven't started any form of planning, and some have started planning on the battery storage side of things and didn't get a Gate 2 offer. Just really want to show you guys how many projects on the tech register haven't entered any form of planning. And they may even have pre-land. And again, as Tom touched on, there's a lot of projects on the tech register where there's no clarification between what technology capacity there is. So although it may be a 1 gigawatt project, there's no clarity between if it's BESS, wind or solar. But this is when you take into account a lot of those projects. Now, basically the red bar shows pre-application, pre-consultation, any form of existence other than on the tech register. And immediately you can see T1, T2. Scotland is just so oversubscribed, but there's absolutely nothing in there in terms of pipeline, nothing in ECU. So I just thought that was a really interesting graphic to kind of show developers buying up cheap grid where there's a lot of grid available for these projects without actually advancing the projects themselves.
Josh, do you have an idea if those projects are just very early stage, i.e. they only, people only applied for them quite recently, or that they have been around a long time and it's just that people aren't progressing their development?
I think in Scotland, a lot of developers over the last kind of 3 years have seen opportunity there, because as I said, it's quite like there's cheap grid, there's a lot of land available, and there's not much pipeline in terms of solar. People have spotted an opportunity up there. And again, battery storage is an absolute necessity with the amount of wind farms going on. There's not many co-located wind farms at the moment, so people are seeing an opportunity up there. So as I said, although this looks like a solar queue because of the lack of clarity between technologies, a lot of this could be BESS, that developers are only building out the BESS side of things or have only applied for the battery storage side of things. In terms of T4, 5, 6, they've always had big queues. We know a lot of the reasons why, and that's just been growing over the years.
Great, thank you, Josh. I think that with the sort of headlines about oversubscription and the sort of capacities all being met, it could be said that, you know, there's nowhere for investors or developers in the UK to go. You know, like we've got now a pipeline of projects that will be connected, and there's no or low chance of a new project being connected. So I suppose what would the advice be to developers sort of looking at the UK market, and is that view that there is sort of no progression option now for new projects accurate?
I'll start. I can start with this one, Tom.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we'll go on to the final slide, actually, just to kind of, that feeds into this question a lot. This is basically a breakdown of the entire battery storage queue, pre-Gate 2 offers. So we can see the huge pipeline that Tom touched on earlier, breaking it down from very early stage tech stuff, pre-planning, and then you've got approved projects at 80.7 gigawatts, which essentially meets the exact figure that received Gate 2 offers. Which is no coincidence. And then, as Tom also mentioned, there's 44 gigawatts that have been submitted and are awaiting a decision. Nearly all of these will have received a Gate 1 offer. Some developers are more confident at the next round about receiving Gate 2 offers, because it really depends where you are. I know, again, Scotland, there are a lot of Gate 1 offered projects with not many Gate 2 offers for BESS. So it will be interesting to see if more get Gate 2 offers. But that kind of feeds into, is there any for BESS? Is there any greenfield opportunities? And I think it really depends where, and also how many projects now of this 82 gigawatts are going to fall away. I know developers who have got only phase 2 offers. So although they've got their Gate 2 phase 2 offers really aren't particularly desirable at the moment. And so if they've got no if they've got slight cash flow problems, they may have to drop a lot of these projects, and that 82 gigawatts could fall away pretty quickly. So it'll be really interesting to see kind of how much of that phase 2 does drop off. Phase 1, a lot of it will be built out. BESS is an absolute necessity. But the phase 2 stuff, I'm really interested to see how much of it goes ahead, and see how many projects actually drop off, see if there's co-development. Maybe some people have solar Gate 2 and then BESS Gate 2, will they co-develop them? So I think that's a really interesting opportunity.
Tom, you had something too on that?
Yeah, I understand the feeling of there aren't opportunities, or the amount of uncertainty that sits in GB at the moment for project development is very high, especially when compared internationally. But there are opportunities that we see coming through for greenfield development included in the future. I think the key aspect is you can't ignore the reforms in this and the current targets as they're set, and you have to strategically pick the technology that you develop, as well as where in the country that you initiate those projects. So battery is certainly the most challenging at the moment. Just referring to the final 3 columns, the oversupply of ready projects alone, so sites that already have met that minimum criteria of holding land, of an oversupply of 215 gigawatts means you are in very strong competition from existing sites that are likely to be more progressed. However, for solar and onshore wind, we're expecting, there's less of that competition on a GB-wide level. And then when you look zonally at the targets of the different transmission zones, there are some areas where the pipeline of sites is lower than what the solar targets were set as, or what the wind targets were set as. And so in those zones, positioning yourself to start project development early, so that by the time the application windows start opening, and specifically by the time the next updates to these strategic targets comes through, which will be with the publication of the SSEP, that will be accounting for new demand growth that's come from data centers that's not currently reflected in these targets. And so there is the opportunity to move now to advance projects early on and position yourself to get a gate 2 offer in the future. But the picture has changed, and developers will generally need to invest more upfront in project development, and sometimes before even having full visibility on the grid connection offer. So that aspect of development in GB, where you need to proactively invest in a site before it stands a chance of obtaining an offer, that's increased by the reforms and the updated application windows, which is the route to getting a connection date secured for your site.
Yeah. Molly, can I come in as well? I think.
Please do, yeah.
Yeah. So I think, battery is definitely going to be a really difficult place to enter the queue. It's worth noting there's a couple of points here. One is there will be a number of gigawatts of batteries, I wouldn't know the exact number, that will have a protection 3A clause. So they're protected under 3A, which means that they applied for planning before December the 20th, 2024, and therefore they are guaranteed a gate 2 offer in the next window. So there will be a number of projects which will actually increase that oversupply. Then also a good thing to think about here, and there's a question that's been in the Q&A that someone's asked, will these capacities increase? So the phase 2 strategic targets that Tom's put here on the left, there is a possibility they increase, and particularly battery through the strategic spatial energy plans. So the SSEP that is meant to be in place in 2027 now, and that can uplift those capacities if the plans show that we need more than we thought. Now, if they're less, which is a possibility, the capacities can't go down. So that's just something to bear in mind. The amount that we connect is sort of stuck, at least at that level, but it could go up. And then I think attrition is a really interesting point. Josh has mentioned cash flow, which I think is going to be really interesting this year, as projects have to manage a much longer period of uncertainty than they may be expected. So I think projects have been really struggling to invest and go through financial investment decisions for the last 12 months, and they're unlikely to be able to do that and for another 12 months while we're waiting for the gate 2 offers to come out. So those companies which are trying to develop a large pipeline or don't quite have the cash flow to support those projects before they either sell them to someone that's going to build them, or they can get financing in for them, may struggle. And so I think that's a really interesting point by Josh. And on that note of cash flow, securities, so the securities that projects have to put up in order to sort of keep their grid connections, particularly at transmission, could be significantly higher than what people are currently paying, because they've been frozen for a couple of years. And so as those securities come in, people may feel that it's not worth the sort of cash and that they have to put up in order to keep those connections, and they may actually choose not to accept the gate 2 offers because those securities are high. So yeah, there's lots of interesting points around attrition.
I suppose a final contributor to attrition will be just the fact that these offers will change significantly, including co-located sites that lose one of their 2 technology types. And that alone can be enough to kill the project, and it will free up space in these buckets, these targets, ahead of the coming 434 application windows. So it's that combination of the potential uplift of the targets from the SSCP and attrition of the existing queue that we're expecting to see right away once the Gate 2 offers are issued Q2, Q3 of this year.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to note, is the lack of co-location taken into account. I mean, there's a lot of projects that are unfeasible without both solar and BESS, wind and BESS co-location. And because NESO haven't looked at them as one project, they've looked at them as 2 different things. They've given Gate 1s to mainly BESS, and then a Gate 2 to the solar side of things. But obviously without the BESS, the solar can't be built. And so there's going to be a lot of attrition there with the solar side of things potentially, because these projects just aren't feasible without both technologies. Also, just to touch on the cash flow side of things again, I know a lot of developers, or some developers specifically, have changed their business model slightly over the last kind of 12 months, where generally there'd be an IPP, they like to build out their projects, their pipelines. Some developers have over 20 projects at ready to build stage, or around 20 projects. And with the grid reform, they expected that whole pipeline to kind of be squished into phase 1 because they were expecting advancement. So they may have had a ready to build, or at least an approved project for a 2032 grid connection date. They expected that to be brought forward to kind of 2029, 2028. And there just isn't, they don't have the resource to build out that entire pipeline. And so they've had to sell off some of them in order to help with the cash flow, in order to help free up resource and not put too much pressure on the development side of things. And now they're kind of, they've taken a little bit of a hit, because although they've sold these projects now, or they're going through the process, whatever they're planning to do with these projects, they've not been given that advancement. And so their pipeline has actually, although it's shrunk, they don't have the projects now to build out. And I think that that's happened to a number of developers. While some developers have taken a bit of a punt, they bought these projects again and not got the advancement they were hoping for. So I think that's quite an important thing to touch on.
Yeah, definitely. Now, just keeping an eye on the time and wanting to get to the questions eventually, I am noticing a few coming through that are sort of slightly technical on the results, that the answers would be sort of for NESO itself to give. I think, though, that does highlight the fact that, again, there's been a fairly high level of confusion throughout the process. Alongside that confusion, there's been a lot of change on NESO's side. If you look at the timeline for grid connection reform on their page, you would be forgiven for thinking that everything happened as planned when it was meant to. But if you kind of compare with essentially screenshots on LinkedIn, perhaps in your own camera roll, the deadlines for everything more or less was pushed back, was shifted. There are obviously some fairly major tech issues as well with the application portal. And I suppose this raises a bit of a question about whether there is any accountability for NESO and those in charge of managing the connection reform. I know obviously that NESO is a fairly young body itself, only formed sort of, what was it, like late 24, I think. But yeah, I wonder if any of you have any thoughts on that accountability piece for the management of this process.
Yeah, I can come in here, Molly. I think there's a lot of frustration in the developer community, investment community, about how grid connections reform has been managed by NESO and implemented. And I think that frustration is justified. It is a once in a generation, I would say, process. It's not, not something that we have ever done before in the UK. And I think therefore that's something to consider. And I would say that, the people at NESO and a government and Ofgem and that are working hard. But I think that there's only, you can work as hard as you like. Sometimes that doesn't yield the results you need, and working harder isn't always going to solve the problem. And so I think where I'm slightly disappointed and where I think there needs to be that accountability is to challenge and sort of, and this is where I suppose DESNZ, so the government and mission control really should be coming in, is challenging people to do things differently, think about problems in a different way, maybe, consider outside help or outside, other companies that may be able to do things who are experts in that field. So if you take the connection portal, was there enough scrutiny about who was being used for that, and making sure that it was rolled out in a way that was appropriate? I mean, there's lots of people that have rolled out portals in this world. I'm sure it could have been done slightly better. But looking to the future, because I don't want to dwell on the past, is how do we make sure that NESO are treating this with the right urgency, because this affects people's jobs, affects people's livelihoods, and companies' fortunes. So how do we make sure that NESO and Ofgem are treating this with the right urgency, and are getting through problems and solving problems in creative ways? And that's where I feel the government and mission control need to come in and really challenge people as to, are you doing this the best way?
And I'd say the industry generally is wanting as much transparency on the process that has been followed, as well as the opportunities in future windows as we can. So NESO published data as opposed to independent assessments like what Blake Clough and Innova work with developers on.
And I should probably say it's not just NESO, there's the networks as well, obviously, TOs and the transmission owners, the distribution owners. And obviously they all have different ways of doing things. So are they sharing knowledge? Are they, I think some DNOs, actually, I have to give them credit, have done a really good job of certain aspects of this implementing connections reform. And, there's a question of, could other DNOs, could other networks, transmission owners be sort of encouraged to learn from them to do things quicker and better?
Thank you. So let's take a look at some of these questions that we've had flowing in. Now, there have been a few on sort of community ownership. I think a good place to start for that would be a question as to whether social factors such as community ownership and community benefits will be factored into queue allocation. I mean, I think that it's perhaps worth noting that obviously planning factors in things like community benefits, and without planning, you're going to struggle to get a good stake in the queue. I don't know, this person's asked if the panel would support that. I think for me, I would say that there's definitely a place for social factors to be factored in, whether on the sort of queue side is the right place for that to be. I don't know. I think that the queue management has perhaps necessarily to be very technical, but I wonder if any of the other panel members have a thought on this.
I can come in. So I tend to agree with you, Molly. I'm not sure that community benefits, queue for allowing people into the queue that provide more community benefits is the right sort of way to go. I suppose it's worth noting that the SSCP will include various factors, so societal factors as well as environmental factors, planning factors, etc., when sort of deciding how many gigawatts of various technologies should be in each area. And there are, many consultations on the SSCP, so encourage people to feed into that. But I guess there is a question mark of, is there a better way to make sure people give community benefits or the community benefits from these applications? I suppose that's more of for me, a planning process than it is a grid connections process.
Yeah. Sort of rumbling through a little bit because there's lots of questions coming in now. And just to note that obviously we are all available to speak to after the webinar. Please do reach out. But we've had a few questions as well on sort of challenging results. I think what's interesting to look at is whether or not appealing / challenging your offer is worth doing, or whether to sort of bide your time and focus on that next round. I wonder if Josh or Tom, either of you sort of have a sense of where effort is better focused.
I think we're seeing a lot of challenges and engagement between developers and NESO. But for individual sites and projects, I mean, it can't hurt for the developer, but individual sites and projects that you're sitting on a gate 1 offer or didn't go through the gate 2 to whole queue process, really looking to the future application windows. Blake Clough are engaging with NESO on the possibility of a improved protection clause for any sites that were misallocated in the gate 2 to whole queue process, to try to prioritize those for advancement. But at this time, we work with the application windows that we have, and NESO has said that the gate 2 queue is fixed and they're not showing willingness to move on that, because that would then impact the studies and the offers that they're issuing out. So while there are conversations ongoing with it, and reach out if that is something you want to be involved in, but the priority now is looking to the future windows and looking at greenfield as an alternative to further pursuing your gate 1 offer. So if you hold a gate 1 offer that has met the criteria that will give it future protections, that has increased value. Whereas if it's a gate 1 offer with no future protections, it's comparable to a greenfield application at this time, based on how they will assess batches of applicants in future windows. And so you may wish to look targeting a new zone where, based on the current targets, you have the least competition from existing sites. But then within that zone, we now have an uneven distribution of where gate 1 projects have been removed from the queues, which leaves areas of the network where there are pockets with capacity for an efficient grid connection. So changing that approach and starting from the network and targeting specific sites and nodes to initiate new sites could be the best viable approach for developers at the moment.
Yeah, I think understanding what's around you when you take these projects forward is the most important thing right now. Again, you can have protections, but understanding your competition is the number one thing you can do. And as Tom said, greenfield development in regions where there's a lot less competition is a big option right now, especially for the solar side of things. Battery storage, as we've spoken about and touched on, there isn't much greenfield development opportunities. So it all comes down to knowing what's around you, using any kind of researching tools you've got, and identifying, is this project still viable? Do we have any protections? Are there projects around us that, although they're less advanced, they have protections in place? And then moving forward from there. In terms of challenging NESO, I know a lot of people have gone and asked, and this is why it's been quite frustrating with not much clarity from them. as to why people have received Gate 1 offers. They've kind of just been given it. It's left a lot of questions. So there has been a lot of challenges going around, but it's yet to be seen how successful any of them have actually been.
Yeah, just on challenging outcomes here. So I suppose you've got to split it into two bits. If you believe that NISO have not followed the methodology correctly, then that is absolutely something that can be challenged and should be challenged through either the various dispute processes that exist. And I would seek legal advice and technical advice of someone who really fully understands the methodologies. But from what I've seen from the outcomes, it seems that NISO have followed the methodologies, and I'm struggling to see anywhere where they haven't followed the methodologies correctly. Now, if the outcome isn't something you wanted and the connection dates aren't correct or aren't as early as you want, I think that's much more difficult to challenge. And you have to remember that connection dates are not the same as cube positions. So someone may have an earlier connection date than you because they're in a different part of the country. Perhaps a certain GSP doesn't require as many reinforcements. So someone may be behind you in the queue but have an earlier connection date, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the process hasn't been followed correctly. So I think challenging connection date is much, much harder. I think it's worth noting here that we are aware of NGET particularly delaying projects that have got 27 and 26 connection dates. Again, I think although the wording and the communication suggested that you would keep your 26, 27 connection date, I'm struggling to find a way to challenge the fact that you're going to have a later connection date now, purely because of delivery milestones and the delivery of those reinforcements. So yeah, unfortunately, perhaps the only avenue there is more about looking at National Grid's license conditions and whether you feel they've breached a license condition in terms of their commitment to deliver projects on time. So yeah, that's my best advice.
Bob, I think with sort of then looking to reapply in the upcoming windows, it's also worth noting that not every offer given, which is what these headline results are, will be accepted. We had a question actually about what everyone's thoughts are on the rates of acceptance. It's worth noting as well that there, as part of the reform to the process, Ofgem did approve a financial, can't think of the word, but you developers who accept offers and then don't progress to the projected timeline will have to pay sort of penalty fees, which I think will bring down the rate of acceptance, particularly for those who have received offers perhaps for multiple projects that, as Josh touched on earlier, won't be financially viable to progress all at once. I think we pretty much have to finish there. But like I say, everyone is available. Feel free to reach out via Solar Power Portal, and we can put you in touch with the relevant panel member, or to reach out directly. And also just to note that the webinar has been recorded and everybody who registered will receive the recording of the webinar. We also, at the Solar and Finance Investment Summit in London at the beginning of February, will be further discussing grid connections. So, anyone keen to keep discussing this, please do seek us out at that event. But I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us, and thank you to all of our viewers as well and everyone who sent a question. We'll do our best to get back to those as well, as and when is possible. So yeah, that's the end of our webinar, and thank you everyone.
Thank you all very much for tuning in.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys.